The Stranger in Chains. The sun was a harsh and unforgiving orb over the mining colony of Karen 9. Dust storms rolled across the barren wastelands, coating everything in a thin, gritty film. Inside the facility's main yard, Jake tightened a loose valve on a transport unit, his mind half focused on the task and half wondering. Life here was monotonous, predictable, until today. A commotion broke the silence. Slavers, loud and brash, arrived with a new batch of prisoners. Jake looked up from his work, wiping sweat from his brow. Most of the prisoners looked defeated, eyes down, shoulders slumped, their chains rattling with every step. But one of them stood out. She was tall and lean, her features sharp and otherworldly. Her skin shimmered faintly, a pale silver hue that caught the sunlight like polished metal. Her piercing violet eyes scanned the yard, not with fear, but with a cold, calculating intensity. Jake noticed her hands, bound in heavy restraints, yet resting calmly at her sides, as though she was merely biding her time. "Move, alien scum," barked one of the guards, shoving her forward with the butt of his rifle. She stumbled slightly but didn't fall. Instead, she turned her head slowly, fixing the guard with a glare that made even Jake shiver. The guard hesitated before barking another order, his bravado faltering. Jake couldn't look away. Something about her was different, dangerous. He had seen hundreds of prisoners pass through Karen 9, but none had ever carried themselves like this. The other workers seemed to feel it too, their chatter subdued as the slavers marched the group toward the holding cells. Later, during his lunch break, Jake couldn't shake the image of the alien woman from his mind. Her violet eyes haunted him, as if they held secrets too vast to comprehend. His curiosity got the better of him. Instead of heading to the mess hall, he made his way to the holding area. The cells were dimly lit, the air heavy with despair. Most of the prisoners sat silently, their gazes fixed on the ground. But she was different. She stood near the edge of her cell, her hands gripping the bars lightly, as though testing their strength. Jake approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. "You shouldn't be here," she said without looking at him, her voice low and calm. It startled him. He hadn't expected her to speak. "I was just checking the locks," Jake lied, fumbling for an excuse. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. "No, you weren't." Jake swallowed hard, feeling an inexplicable chill run down his spine. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A prisoner," she replied simply, "like the others." "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "You're not like the others. I can see it." She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "You're observant," she said. "That might keep you alive." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his heart pounding. There was something unnerving about how calm she was, how measured her words were. Before she could answer, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the corridor. A guard appeared, glaring at Jake. "What are you doing here?" the man barked. "Just inspecting the locks," Jake said quickly, stepping back. "Well, they don't need inspecting," the guard snapped. "Get back to work." Jake nodded and left, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As he walked away, he glanced back over his shoulder. The alien woman was still standing there, watching him with those unnervingly violet eyes. That night, Jake lay awake in his bunk, her words replaying in his mind. "That might keep you alive." What did she mean by that? And why did he feel like she was more than just a prisoner? As the colony settled into its uneasy quiet, Jake resolved to find out. Something about her didn't just intrigue him, it warned him. The stranger in chains wasn't just another captive. She was something more, something dangerous, and he had seen it first. Signs of a warrior. The next morning, the colony buzzed with tension. The arrival of the new prisoners had unsettled the workers, and the guards seemed on edge. Jake noticed the extra patrols, the sharp looks exchanged between slavers, and the way their hands hovered near their weapons. Something was different today. Jake kept his head down, moving through the dusty corridors of the facility. His job was simple: maintain the machinery, ensure the transports ran smoothly, and avoid trouble. But his thoughts kept drifting to the alien woman in the holding cell. Her calm defiance, the strange symbols etched into her skin, and the cryptic warning she had given him. It all gnawed at his mind. By mid-afternoon, Jake found himself near the holding area again. He knew he shouldn't be there, but his curiosity was stronger than his fear. The guards were distracted, arguing over a damaged security drone. So Jake slipped into the shadowed corridor. He moved quietly, his heart pounding, until he reached her cell. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her eyes closed, as if meditating. Her silver skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the strange markings on her arms shimmered. Jake leaned closer, squinting to make out the symbols. They looked ancient, unlike anything he had seen before. Then it hit him. He had seen something similar in an old forbidden text back on Earth, a book about alien civilizations long thought extinct. "You're back," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her eyes opened, and Jake froze, caught in her intense violet gaze. I was just passing by," he stammered, his face flushing. She smirked, a hint of amusement flickering across her features. "You're a terrible liar." Jake sighed, stepping closer to the bars. "What are those symbols on your skin?" "I've seen something like them before, in a book." Her smirk faded, replaced by a guarded look. "They're the mark of my people," she said slowly. "A reminder of who we were, and who we could be again." "What happened to your people?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "We were warriors once, protectors of the weak. But greed and betrayal destroyed us. Now, we're scattered, hunted, enslaved." Her voice hardened, and her eyes burned with quiet fury. "But not all of us have forgotten who we are." Jake felt a chill. "You're not just any prisoner, are you? You're here for a reason." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I came here to end this, to destroy the slavers and free those they've taken. But I can't do it alone." Jake's mind raced. Her calm defiance, the marks on her skin, her cryptic warning. It all made sense now. She wasn't a victim. She was a threat, a warrior in disguise, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching boots echoed down the corridor. The guards were coming. Jake glanced at her, panic flashing across his face. "Go," she hissed. "If they catch you here, they'll kill you." Reluctantly, Jake turned and slipped away, his heart pounding as he darted back to his workstation. But even as he tried to focus on his work, her words echoed in his mind. She was planning something dangerous, and for some reason, she had chosen to tell him. Later that evening, Jake sat alone in the dimly lit mess hall, his food untouched. His thoughts swirled with questions. Why had she trusted him? What could he possibly do to help her? And what would happen if the slavers found out? As he stared at his plate, a fight broke out across the room. Two guards were arguing, their voices rising. Jake wasn't paying attention until he heard one of them say, "The silver one. She's not normal. I've seen her watching us, like she's planning something." Jake's blood ran cold. The guards were noticing her too. It was only a matter of time before they acted. That night, as the colony settled into uneasy silence, Jake made a decision. He didn't know why, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. The stranger in chains wasn't just a prisoner. She was a warrior, and she needed his help. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. The escape plan. The following day, Jake worked in the machinery bay, trying to focus on his tasks. Yet his mind was elsewhere, racing with the implications of what he had learned. Tivera, the alien woman, wasn't just another prisoner. She was a warrior with a purpose. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he didn't act, the slavers would discover her plan and crush it before it began. By midday, an opportunity presented itself. The guards called an emergency meeting, likely to address the increasing tension among the prisoners. Jake seized the chance to sneak back into the holding cells. The security drones were offline for maintenance, leaving the area unguarded. He found Tuvera sitting in the same spot, her back against the wall, her eyes closed. She didn't move as he approached, but when he spoke, her voice cut through the silence. "You're either brave or foolish to come back here," she said without opening her eyes. "Maybe both," Jake replied, crouching by the bars. "But I can't stand by and do nothing. If you're planning something, I want to help." She opened her eyes, studying him carefully. For a moment, she said nothing, as if weighing her options. Finally, she leaned closer, her voice a whisper. "Helping me will put a target on your back. Are you ready for that?" Jake hesitated but nodded. "I've spent my whole life fixing machines, doing what I'm told. I'm tired of it. If there's a chance to fight back, I'll take it." Tuvera's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good. Then listen closely." She shifted slightly, revealing a small makeshift device hidden beneath her tunic. It was no larger than Jake's palm, pieced together from scraps of metal, wires, and circuit boards. Jake's eyes widened as she explained its purpose. "This is a disruptor," she said. "It'll disable the facility's security systems for a short time, long enough for me to reach the weapons depot. But it's incomplete. I need someone who knows the facility's systems to finish it." Jake stared at the device, his mind racing. "Where did you even get the parts for this?" Her eyes gleamed. "You'd be surprised what you can find if you pay attention. The slavers are careless. They think we're too broken to fight back." Jake nodded, examining the device. He recognized the components immediately and realized it wouldn't take much to complete. But the risk was enormous. If the guards caught him tampering with their systems, they wouldn't hesitate to execute him. "I'll do it," he said finally. "But I need time. I can't finish this without access to the main control room." Tuvera leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You'll have your time. But remember, if you fail, we're both dead." For the next few days, Jake worked in secret, stealing moments to gather the parts he needed. He studied the disruptor whenever he could, marveling at Tuvera's ingenuity. Despite the crude materials, the device was sophisticated, far beyond anything he could have built on his own. Meanwhile, the tension in the colony continued to grow. The slavers had increased their patrols, and whispers of rebellion spread among the prisoners. Jake overheard guards talking about sabotage, their voices laced with paranoia. It was clear they suspected something, but they didn't know where to look, yet. Late one night, Jake crept into the control room. His heart pounded as he bypassed the security protocols, his fingers flying across the console. The disruptor needed one final adjustment to sync with the facility's systems, and Jake knew this was his only chance. As he worked, he thought of Tuvera, her calm defiance, her unwavering determination. It was inspiring. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Suddenly, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. The guards were doing their rounds earlier than usual. He quickly hid the disruptor and resumed working on a routine maintenance task, hoping to avoid suspicion. A pair of guards entered, their eyes scanning the room. "What are you doing here?" one of them demanded. "Fixing the coolant system," Jake replied, keeping his tone neutral. "It's been acting up again." The guard frowned but seemed satisfied. "Finish up and get out. This area's restricted after hours." Jake nodded, watching them leave before resuming his work. His hands trembled, but he managed to complete the disruptor. He tucked it into his tool bag and slipped out of the control room, his heart still racing. The next day, Jake returned to Tuvera's cell. She was waiting for him, her violet eyes sharp with anticipation. He handed her the completed disruptor, his chest swelling with pride. "It's ready," he said. She examined the device, nodding approvingly. "You've done well, Jake. Better than I expected. What happens now?" he asked. Tivera's expression hardened. Now we prepare. When the time comes, there will be chaos. You'll need to decide where you stand. Jake felt a chill at her words. The path he had chosen was dangerous, and there was no turning back. But as he looked into Tivera's eyes, he felt a spark of hope. The fight for freedom was beginning, and he was ready to play his part. Betrayal among the guards. The atmosphere in the colony grew increasingly tense as the days passed. The slavers were restless, their paranoia mounting with every passing hour. Guards doubled their patrols, prisoners were interrogated at random, and whispers of rebellion echoed through the holding cells. Jake could feel the pressure building, like the quiet before a storm. Tivera, however, remained calm. She spent her days observing the guards, memorizing their patterns, and communicating silently with the other prisoners. Her confidence was infectious, and Jake found himself inspired by her unwavering determination. But the risks were growing. Every time he slipped away to meet with her, he felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching him. One evening, as Jake finished his shift in the machinery bay, a guard named Briggs cornered him. Briggs was a hulking man with a cruel streak, notorious for tormenting prisoners and workers alike. He grabbed Jake by the collar, his eyes narrowing. "You've been spending a lot of time near the cells," Briggs growled. "Care to explain why?" Jake's mind raced. "Just doing my job," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The locks on the cells are part of my maintenance rounds." Briggs stared at him for a long moment before releasing him. "You'd better not be lying, kid," he said, his tone threatening. "If I catch you doing anything suspicious, you'll wish you were one of the prisoners." Jake nodded, forcing himself to remain calm as Briggs walked away. But his heart was pounding. The guards were starting to notice him, and that was dangerous. That night, Jake met with Tivera in the shadows of the holding area. She listened carefully as he recounted his encounter with Briggs, her expression unreadable. "They're onto us," Jake said. "It's only a matter of time before they figure out what we're doing." "They suspect something," Tivera replied, her voice calm. "But they don't know enough to act yet. We still have time." Jake frowned. "What if they find the disruptor?" "They won't," Tivera said firmly. "I've hidden it where they'll never look. But we need to act soon. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes." Before Jake could respond, a commotion erupted in the holding area. 2 guards were shouting, their voices rising over the hum of the facility. Jake and Tivera exchanged a glance before moving closer to investigate. In the center of the holding area, a prisoner named Lorik, a wiry alien with sharp, darting eyes, was being dragged from his cell. He struggled against the guards, shouting curses in a language Jake didn't understand. "What's going on?" Jake whispered. Tivera's expression darkened. "Lorik's a spy. He's been feeding the guards information in exchange for favors." Jake felt a knot of anger and betrayal in his chest. Why would he do that? "Fear," Tivera said simply. "Not everyone is willing to risk their life for freedom." The guards shoved Lorik into the center of the room, forcing him to kneel. One of them, a tall, scared man named Commander Hark, stepped forward, his voice cold and menacing. "Tell me what you know," Hark demanded. "Who's planning the sabotage? Who's working with the prisoners?" Lorik shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know anything. I swear." Hark's expression hardened. "You've been lying to us, Lorik, and I don't tolerate liars." Without warning, Hark drew his weapon and fired, the sound echoing through the holding area. Lorik slumped to the ground, motionless. The room fell silent, the prisoners staring in stunned horror. Jake felt sick. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The cold brutality of the act left him shaken. But as he glanced at Tivera, he saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. Later, in the quiet of the machinery bay, Jake confronted Tivera. "They killed him without hesitation," he said, his voice shaking. "What if they find out about us?" "They won't," Tivera said, her voice steady. "And even if they do, We can't stop now. If we let fear control us, we've already lost. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. You make it sound so easy. It's not easy, Tivera said, her tone softening. But it's necessary. If we don't fight back, who will? Jake nodded, her words giving him strength. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn back now. As the colony settled into uneasy silence, Jake and Tivera prepared for the next step of their plan. The guards were on high alert, the prisoners restless, and the air thick with tension. Jake could feel the storm coming, and he knew it would change everything. But as he looked at Tivera, he felt a spark of hope. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a leader. And for the first time in his life, Jake believed they might actually have a chance. Unleashing her power, the colony was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The guards patrolled with weapons ready, the prisoners whispered in hushed tones, and even the machinery seemed to hum with nervous energy. Jake felt the weight of what was coming, but there was no turning back now. The disruptor was ready, the plan was in motion, and Tivera had assured him the next step would tip the balance. That evening, Jake met Tivera in a hidden maintenance tunnel beneath the holding cells. The narrow space was damp and dark, lit only by a faint blue glow emanating from the disruptor Tivera held in her hands. She examined it carefully, her sharp features illuminated in the dim light. "Are you sure this will work?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It will work," Tivera replied confidently. "Once the disruptor activates, the guards' weapons, security systems, and communication channels will be disabled for precisely 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Jake repeated, his heart racing. "That's not much time." "It's enough," Tivera said, her eyes narrowing. "Once their systems go down, chaos will spread. That's when we strike." Jake nodded, swallowing his fear. "And you? What will you do?" Tivera's expression hardened. "I'll do what I was trained to do." Jake wanted to ask what that meant, but before he could, Tivera stood and motioned for him to follow. They made their way through the tunnels, emerging near the colony's power hub. Tivera paused, her gaze scanning the area for guards. "Stay here," she instructed. "I'll plant the disruptor. Once it activates, you'll need to guide the prisoners to the armory." "What about you?" Jake asked. "I'll handle the guards," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Then, without another word, she slipped into the shadows, moving with a grace that seemed almost inhuman. Jake waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Every second felt like an eternity. Then suddenly, the lights flickered, and an ear-splitting alarm blared throughout the facility. The disruptor had been activated. Chaos erupted almost immediately. Guards shouted orders, their voices tinged with panic, as their weapons malfunctioned, and their communication devices crackled with static. Prisoners in the holding cells began to shout and bang on the bars, sensing their chance for freedom. Jake sprang into action, rushing toward the cells. He used the master control panel to unlock the doors, freeing the prisoners. "Follow me," he shouted. "We're taking the armory." The prisoners hesitated at first, unsure whether to trust him. But then one of them, a burly alien with a scared face, stepped forward. "If you're willing to risk your neck for us, then we're with you." With that, the group surged forward, following Jake through the labyrinthine corridors. Along the way, they encountered pockets of resistance, guards scrambling to regain control of the situation. But the prisoners outnumbered them, overwhelming them with sheer force. Meanwhile, Tivera moved like a shadow through the chaos, her every step purposeful. She encountered a group of guards in the central corridor, their faces twisted with fear as they tried to reactivate their weapons. Tivera didn't wait for them to figure it out. She lunged forward, her silver skin shimmering as her true form began to emerge. The markings on her arms glowed brightly, and with a sudden burst of energy, she unleashed a wave of force that sent the guards flying. Their weapons clattered to the ground, useless. Tivera picked up a fallen blade, her movements fluid and precise, as she dispatched the remaining guards with a series of swift, calculated strikes. By the time the corridor fell silent, Tivera stood alone, her breathing steady. She wiped the blade clean and continued toward the command center, her mind focused on one goal: eliminating Commander Hark. Jake and the prisoners reached the armory, where they armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Blasters, stun batons, and crude makeshift tools were distributed among the group. Jake grabbed a compact energy rifle, his hands trembling as he checked the charge. "Let's move," he said, his voice firm despite his fear. "We need to secure the hangar." As they made their way toward the hangar, they encountered heavier resistance. The guards had regrouped, forming a defensive line to block their advance. A fierce battle erupted, blaster fire lighting up the dim corridors. Jake ducked behind cover, his heart racing as he fired back at the guards. It was in the midst of this chaos that Tivera appeared. She entered the fray like a force of nature, her glowing markings casting an eerie light over the battlefield. She moved with deadly precision, her blade slicing through the guards' defenses. The prisoners cheered as they watched her fight, their morale bolstered by her display of power. Jake couldn't help but marvel at her. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, a warrior in every sense of the word. But as he watched her fight, he realized something else. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them, for their freedom. As the last of the guards fell, Tivera turned to Jake. "The hangar is just ahead," she said. "Once we secure it, we can use the transports to evacuate the prisoners." Jake nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. "What about Commander Hark?" Tivera's expression darkened. "Leave him to me." Jake watched as she disappeared into the shadows once more, her glowing markings fading into the darkness. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Jake felt like they might actually win. The final stand. The hangar was massive, its cavernous space filled with transport ships, cargo crates, and the echoes of chaos. The guards had fortified the area, barricading themselves behind stacks of supplies and defensive turrets. Their desperation was palpable. This was their last stand, and they knew it. Jake and the prisoners stood at the edge of the hangar, weapons in hand, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. Tivera wasn't with them. She had gone ahead to confront Commander Hark, leaving Jake to lead the charge. He took a deep breath, gripping his energy rifle tightly. This wasn't the life he had chosen, but it was the one he found himself in. And for the first time, he felt like he was fighting for something that mattered. "Listen up," Jake called out, his voice carrying over the din. "We have one shot at this. Stick together, cover each other, and keep moving forward. Don't stop until we control the hangar." The prisoners nodded, their resolve hardening. With a shout, they surged forward, firing at the guards as they advanced. The air filled with the whine of blaster fire and the deafening clang of energy bolts striking metal. Jake stayed near the front, ducking behind crates for cover as he fired at the guards. The guards fought fiercely, using their superior positioning to their advantage. Defensive turrets rained fire down on the prisoners, forcing them to scatter and regroup. Jake's heart pounded as he darted between cover, shouting orders and trying to keep everyone together. Meanwhile, in the command center, Tivera faced Commander Hark. The room was stark and utilitarian, its walls lined with monitors displaying the chaos in the hangar. Hark stood at the center, his face twisted in anger and defiance. He was a large man, his armor gleaming and his weapon, a plasma axe, humming with deadly energy. "I should have known you were trouble the moment you arrived," Hark growled, gripping his weapon tightly. "But it doesn't matter. You're not leaving this colony alive." Tivera stepped forward, her markings glowing brighter. "Neither are you." Hark charged at her, swinging his plasma axe with brutal force. Tivera dodged gracefully, her blade flashing as she countered with a precise strike. The two warriors clashed in a flurry of attacks, their weapons sparking as they collided. Hark fought with raw strength, his movements powerful but unrefined. Tivera, on the other hand, was a blur of speed and precision, her every move calculated. The battle was fierce, each strike sending shockwaves through the room. Hark's size and strength gave him an advantage, but Tivera's agility and skill kept her one step ahead. She moved like a predator, her glowing markings a blur as she danced around his attacks. "You think you can win?" Hark snarled, his voice filled with rage. "You're just another slave, fighting for a lost cause." Tivera's eyes burned with fury. "I fight for freedom, something you'll never understand." With a sudden burst of energy, Tivera unleashed a powerful strike, her blade slicing through Hark's armor. He roared in pain, staggering back, but he wasn't finished yet. Summoning his remaining strength, he lunged at her, his plasma axe swinging in a desperate arc. Tivera sidestepped the attack and delivered a final decisive blow. Her blade pierced Hark's chest, the glowing energy burning through his armor. He gasped, his weapon falling from his hands as he collapsed to the ground. Breathing heavily, Tivera stood over him. "Your reign ends here." Back in the hangar, Jake and the prisoners were making progress. They had taken out one of the defensive turrets and were pushing the guards back. But the fight was far from over. The guards were regrouping, their remaining turret raining fire down on the prisoners. Jake knew they needed to disable it, but it was heavily guarded. He spotted a maintenance ladder leading to a platform above the turret and formulated a plan. "Cover me," he shouted, darting toward the ladder. The prisoners fired at the guards, creating a distraction as Jake climbed. His hands trembled as he reached the platform, the turret's whirring sound deafening in his ears. He took a deep breath and aimed his energy rifle at the turret's power core. With a precise shot, the core exploded, the turret sputtering before going silent. Cheers erupted from the prisoners below as the guards' defenses crumbled. The tide had turned. As the last of the guards were subdued, Tivera appeared in the hangar, her silver skin glistening with sweat and her blade still glowing faintly. The prisoners fell silent as she approached, their eyes filled with awe. "It's over," she said, her voice firm. "The colony is ours." Cheers erupted, the prisoners raising their weapons in triumph. Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him, his exhaustion giving way to pride. They had done it. Together, they had achieved the impossible. But the victory was bittersweet. The colony was still a dangerous place, and the slavers would send reinforcements once they realized what had happened. Tivera knew they couldn't stay. She turned to Jake, her expression serious. "We need to leave," she said. "Gather everyone. We'll take the transports and head for the nearest safe zone." Jake nodded, already moving to organize the prisoners. As they prepared to board the transports, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. For the first time, freedom felt within reach. Redemption and freedom. The transports were nearly full, their engines humming with a readiness that seemed to pulse through the air. Jake stood at the lead transport, his fingers tightening around the control console as he watched the last groups of prisoners shuffle aboard. The weight of the past hours pressed heavily on him, every step, every risk, every life lost to bring them to this moment. Yet, hope burned brighter than ever. Tivera stood by his side, her posture as steady as a mountain. Though her silver skin bore fresh scars from the battle, and her glowing markings had dimmed, her eyes still held the fire of a warrior who refused to back down. The chaos had forged her resolve even sharper, and her presence alone brought a strange comfort to Jake. "We have the transports ready," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "But what if they catch us before we clear the outer perimeter?" Tivera's gaze didn't waver as she responded. "They won't catch us. Not today." Her calm confidence was infectious, and Jake felt a flicker of belief. Still, the sense of dread lingered. He could almost feel the slavers bearing down on them, their rage and desperation propelling them closer with every passing second. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of sirens blared throughout the facility. Red emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the hangar in a foreboding glow. Tivera's eyes sharpened, and she turned toward the entrance. "They're here," she said, her voice low and resolute. Jake followed her gaze as the massive hangar doors rumbled open. A squad of heavily armed slavers marched in, their faces hidden behind ominous helmets. Behind them, a hulking armored vehicle rolled into the hangar, its turret swiveling ominously toward the transports. "Everyone on board, now," Jake shouted, motioning to the stragglers. Tivera stepped forward, her markings beginning to glow faintly once more. She unsheathed her blade, the weapon humming with latent energy. "Get them out of here," she said to Jake. "I'll hold them off." Jake's stomach twisted at her words. "You can't fight them alone." "You'll—" "I won't be alone," she interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "You'll make sure these people escape. That's your fight. This one is mine." Jake wanted to argue, but the fire in her eyes silenced him. He knew she was right. The transports were the priority, and the prisoners needed someone to lead them. Tivera's battle was one she had been preparing for her entire life. The slavers advanced, their weapons raised, but Tivera moved faster. She surged forward with a burst of speed that seemed almost inhuman, her blade slicing through the air with deadly precision. The first wave of slavers fell before they could even fire, their armor crumpling under her relentless strikes. The armored vehicle's turret roared to life, unleashing a hail of energy blasts. Tivera leaped aside, her movements fluid and calculated. With a flick of her wrist, she sent an energy pulse from her blade toward the turret, disabling its targeting system. Sparks flew as the vehicle sputtered, leaving the crew scrambling to regain control. Meanwhile, Jake ushered the last of the prisoners onto the transports. "Get those engines running," he yelled to the pilot of the lead ship. "We're leaving now." The transports began to rise, their thrusters kicking up dust and debris. Jake climbed aboard the last transport, his heart pounding as he watched Tivera continue her fight. She moved like a force of nature, her glowing markings a blur as she weaved through the slavers' ranks. For a moment, Jake thought she might actually win. Then reinforcements poured in. Dozens of slavers stormed into the hangar, their weapons aimed directly at Tivera. She faltered for the first time, her movements slowing as the weight of their numbers pressed against her. Jake's chest tightened. He couldn't just leave her behind. Without thinking, he grabbed the transport's mounted blaster and fired into the crowd of slavers. The burst of energy scattered them, buying Tivera a moment to breathe. She glanced back at Jake, her expression unreadable. "Go," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You have to go." Jake hesitated, his hands trembling. But he knew she was right. If they delayed any longer, the slavers would overwhelm them, and everything they had fought for would be lost. "Get us out of here," Jake yelled to the pilot. The transport engines roared, and the ship lifted off. Jake watched through the rear viewport as Tivera stood alone in the center of the hangar, her blade raised high. She faced the advancing slavers with unshakable defiance, a warrior to the very end. As the transport soared into the sky, Jake felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. They had escaped, but at a cost. He didn't know if Tivera had survived, but he clung to the hope that her strength and determination had carried her through. The prisoners around him were silent, their faces a mixture of relief and grief. They were free, but the price of that freedom weighed heavily on them all. One of the prisoners, a scared alien who had fought alongside Jake, placed a hand on his shoulder. "She gave us a chance," the alien said. "We'll honor her by making the most of it." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. He didn't know what the future held, but he vowed to keep fighting. Tivera's sacrifice would not be in vain. As the transports disappeared into the stars, the hangar below was left in ruins. The slavers' forces had been decimated, their control shattered. And in the center of it all, Tivera stood tall, her glowing markings fading as she prepared for the next fight. Because freedom, she knew, was never truly won. It was earned, battle by battle, sacrifice by sacrifice.